Representative Elise Stefanik from New York's 21st Congressional District, which includes North Country, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. What's that like?
You know, I actually didn't know I was going to be the youngest woman ever elected until after I won my primary. So I went into this race not knowing about the historic nature, and after I won my primary, which was very competitive, the media started covering the race and talking about how I would be the youngest woman ever elected. And what was interesting for me was at campaign rallies, particularly towards the end, parents started bringing their elementary school-age daughters to events. These were non-political families, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated voters, just to show their daughters an example and a role model of what they can achieve. So it's something that I take very seriously as a role model in this country, and not just for Republican women, but for all women who want to break glass ceilings in whatever role they're in, whether it's politics or business or the arts. I think it's very important as a country that we be examples for our young women to see what they can achieve. And it's been great in Congress because on a weekly basis we have young women coming through my office, whether it's young candidates looking for advice, I had a great letter from a middle school aged girl who was running for student council from, I think it was Washington State or Oregon. I know it was on the West Coast, but she sent a letter to this office. So it's really a humbling experience for me, and you know, I just hope I'm a role model for other young women.
At what point did you say, I'm going to run for Congress?
That's a great question. I decided to run for Congress after the 2012 election. I worked on Governor Romney's campaign. I was head of debate prep for Paul Ryan, and I was very disappointed in the outcome of the 2012 election. But I had spent a lot of time thinking about how the Republican Party needs to run new generation candidates and needs to be able to pass our message along to younger voters and particularly young women. And in New York State, I had grown up in my family's small business, which my parents started when I was a kid, and it's gotten harder to grow as a business in New York than it was when they started over 20 years ago. And I just believe that we need policies that promote entrepreneurialism, we need policies that promote innovation and economic growth, but we also need to have a new generation of leadership in Congress. So after 2012, I started working at my family's business, which I grew up around, and I started as a completely no-name candidate, taking on a seated incumbent, and I made the rounds of a very large district. I met with community leaders, local elected officials, business leaders to ask what they were looking for in Congress. And at first blush, I think that many of them were shocked by my age. I was 29 at the time, and that was an impossibility for a 29-year-old to even be remotely possible to win an election, a primary and then a general election. But I turned my youth from a weakness into a strength and just really embraced the fact that I was a young candidate, and it actually worked.
A district that borders Vermont and Canada, how big is it?
The district is 12 counties. It's one of the biggest districts on the East Coast. It's over 16,000 square miles, and it's very mountainous terrain. So the Adirondack Mountains, which are beautiful, are right in the center of the district. And in terms of population, the population is sort of in a circle around the district. It goes from Saratoga County to the Canadian border, and Plattsburgh is just south of Montreal, all the way to Watertown, which is the home of Fort Drum. So I spent a lot of time doing retail grassroots politics. I put over 100,000 miles total on the truck I drove, which, you know, that's a lot of drive time. That's a lot of hard work getting around, going to local events with 5, 10 people, especially at the beginning.
What did you learn about you during the process?
I think any candidate that runs for office and has the courage to put their name on a ballot and to step into the arena, I think you learn a tremendous amount about yourself. You really have to turn inward and question why are you doing this, what you bring to the table to make your case, because particularly early on in my campaign, I was going alone to events and was introducing myself to strangers, and that takes, you know, something within your gut and that inner drive and a sense of doing it beyond yourself for a greater purpose and having a sense of mission in the campaign. So I learned a lot. There are highs and there are lows on every campaign, and you know, it really tests your inner self.
You talk about your mom and dad, the plywood business that they still own and operate. Where did you grow up? And tell us about your parents.
Sure. So I was born in Albany County. I'm a proud upstate New Yorker, and my family's had a home in Essex County since I was 3. So I spent a lot of time growing up between Albany and Essex County, so up and down the Northway. And my dad actually started off in the plywood and lumber business after he graduated from high school. He worked his way up first in the warehouse. He was an on-the-road salesperson when I was born. He ended up managing a local branch of a larger plywood distribution company. And then when I was 7, my parents started our own business. And it was basically to focus on the local small business customers and bringing the highest quality products with the best customer service. So 20 years plus later, we have over 1,000 small business customers. My brother's deeply involved with the business. I have a younger brother. He's 5.5 years younger. And you know, when you grow up in that type of environment and you see that type of risk that your parents go through when they risk really everything we had as a family to start a business from scratch, and it was very, very difficult. And there are still, as any small business owner would tell you, there are still tough times and there are times when it's a bit easier. But you know, I think that work ethic that instilled with me, and seeing how it pays off when you really put your all into something and you focus on customer service, because a lot of what we do in Congress is constituent services, and I try to treat that like a business in the sense that it's customer service. We have to respond very quickly to constituents, but I really credit my parents with the values that they instilled in me, just the strong work ethic, but also in the belief that you can achieve anything. You know, my parents didn't have the opportunity to graduate from college. They're both very smart and very accomplished, and they are from big families, and it just wasn't economically feasible. And they made sure that they invested in my education and wanted to give me better opportunities than they've had.
What does your little brother think of his big sister?
He would be laughing if he heard that question when he watches this. He is a big supporter of me running for office. He is not political at all. He really enjoys golfing. He's doing a great job at my family's business. We are the opposites in many respects, but he is a very supportive brother, and I was proud to have him on the stage when I won both in the primary and November. And there's a great picture of us hugging, which I think was part of it ran in the New York Times, which was pretty neat.
What about your mom and dad? Are they political? Did you talk politics growing up? Did your dad talk about what it was like to grow a business and deal with taxes and government regulation and the rest?
So they're active citizens, and I think they are very typical of small business owners in this country. They pay very close attention to how policies affect their business, whether it's regulatory policies, tax policies, even infrastructure issues, because we're a distribution company. Our trucks are on the road 5 days out of the week. So we're not a traditional political family in the sense that neither of them have ever run for office. They're not on local committees, but they are strong voters. They always voted, and they're civic-minded. But we did talk a lot about the challenges of running a business and government overreach. New York State is not a particularly friendly state to do business. In fact, we rank number 50 in friendliest states to do business, and that was something growing up that I didn't necessarily hear the specific political implications about, you know, we like this candidate or we like this or the other candidate. It was more of, we ought to be supporting policies that will help small businesses grow.
Why are you a Republican?
I'm a Republican because I believe in limited government. I believe that the best way to grow the economy is by small businesses and entrepreneurs. I believe that individuals are the best people to make their decisions. I think Republican principles help the vast majority and all Americans achieve the American dream. And I believe in the Constitution.
You went to Harvard to study what?
I went to Harvard and I studied government. I was very involved at the Institute of Politics, which is an undergraduate organization found in the memory of President John F. Kennedy, and it's bipartisan or nonpartisan. The mission is to encourage young people to get involved in public policy and be engaged civically. So I spent a lot of time outside of the classroom working with other students at the Institute of Politics, and when I was a freshman, a particularly amazing experience I had. The Institute of Politics hosts fellows at Harvard, and one of the fellows my freshman fall was Ted Sorensen, John F. Kennedy's speechwriter. And as a student, you could apply to be their liaison and work with them for a semester. So I was one of 6 liaisons that got to work with Ted Sorensen for a semester. We hosted weekly discussion groups. And for someone like me, or for any student, frankly, just to be able to work with someone and hear them tell stories of such a historic time that I had grown up reading about in history books, it was a very formative moment for me, particularly because he worked for a very young president.
In giving the words to President John F. Kennedy, the inaugural address, Profiles in Courage, and many of the most famous speeches that President Kennedy delivered.
Absolutely.
So you came to Washington to work in the Bush administration. How did that come about?
So I actually didn't have a job until the week I graduated, and I'm sure that made my parents very nervous at the time. I graduated in 2006 from college, and many of my friends went the route of where you get recruited very early in finance or consulting jobs, and that just wasn't the right fit for me. I know I wanted to do something involved in public policy. So I had interviewed at think tanks in Washington. I had interviewed at various parts of the administration under President George W. Bush. And actually a friend of mine who had graduated 2 years earlier than me, a great role model. She's still a very good friend and was definitely my mentor in college. She told me about a staff assistant position at the White House that was open. And I actually didn't get the first staff assistant position. I was passed on. And there was a second one that opened up. I was offered the job a few days before I graduated. And on my first day of work, the Monday after my graduation, I went in to meet the new head of the Domestic Policy Council, Carl Zinsmeister, who had just been appointed, I think, a month earlier. And I was just going in to meet him as the new staff assistant, sort of the lowest member of the ladder right out of college. And he was looking for a West Wing aide. And it was actually kind of shocking at the time because typically before you worked in the West Wing, you had to work your way up. And those jobs weren't for people right out of college. But he took a huge risk on me. He's from upstate New York, from Cazenovia, New York. And interestingly, he's an amateur woodworker. So I talked to him about my family's business and we just hit it off. I worked for the Domestic Policy Council under Carl Zinsmeister for a year. And then I moved downstairs to the first floor of the West Wing, and I worked for the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Joel Kaplan, till the end of the administration.
First time you walked into the White House as a staff assistant, what was your reaction?
I was very nervous because even when you're on staff, particularly the first day when I was going in to meet my boss, you sit in the West Wing lobby. And I think anybody will tell you this who has sat in the West Wing lobby for a type of job interview or just any type of meeting. It's a very nerve-wracking experience, but it's also an incredibly awe-inspiring experience. I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm sitting in the West Wing of the White House. I wouldn't have imagined that a year or even 2 weeks earlier. So it's a moment where you pinch yourself. And Ken Duberstein, who I interned for when I was in college, and he was obviously President Reagan's chief of staff, he gave me a great piece of advice. He said that no matter what you're doing in life or what job you have, pinch yourself every day you go into the West Wing because it's the people's house and it's a true privilege to work there. And I did that, and it was a very formative experience for me.
He is now your colleague, but in 2012 you helped prepare Paul Ryan for the debates, the one debate that he had with Vice President Joe Biden. How did you go about that?
So that was probably one of my most challenging jobs that I've ever had. It was a real privilege working for someone like Paul, who no one knows more about the budget, for example, than Paul Ryan. And as a staffer, what was interesting for me is President Romney's team, not President Romney, then Governor Romney, the presidential campaign, he had gone through many debates. And Paul's debate, there's only one vice presidential debate historically, and Paul hadn't had a debate since his first congressional race. So I worked with the Romney campaign to make sure that Paul had the preparation he needed. But what was interesting is it was very unlike the way they prepared Governor Romney, just in terms of the briefing materials. And it was a lot of time spent with Paul. It was 8 full mock debates where we would work for the stand-in for Vice President Joe Biden, played by Ted Olson. We would prep him and have specific questions and sort of scenarios and play them out. But Paul was very hands-on. He edited all of the materials. It was a constant work in progress. And by the end of it, the briefing materials had an entire briefcase. It was a 40-pound case of briefing materials that would go on the plane every day. And as we were flying to the various campaign stops, Paul would practice various parts of the debate. Sometimes he would review the materials. But it was a great example for me particularly because Paul was younger than I was when he first ran for office. It was truly inspirational, and Paul's encouragement when I told him after the election that I was contemplating, well, what do you think about if I ran for Congress? Paul just said he completely encouraged me, and I really credit that as a turning point.
On the night of the debate, where were you?
I was actually at Center College with Paul. I was there in the back room.
In Kentucky? In
Kentucky. And I was in the room right afterwards when the Secret Service and Paul and his wife, went to the room afterwards, and I thought he did a great job.
Let me ask you about Congress itself, and how do you structure your day here when you're in session? The bells go off sometimes when there are votes. You have meetings with constituents. What's your routine?
Great question. I think it's changed from when I first got here. I think the first few months in Congress, it's pretty overwhelming, just the breadth of the issues that you deal with. My foremost mission is making sure that my constituents are well represented. So we have an eye on constituent services on a daily basis, and that goes from all the way from me down to staff assistants and interns. We're very responsive to all of the constituents. I get morning clips from all of the local news outlets in my district, and because it's such a geographically large district, that's 3 different media markets with a number of dailies and weeklies and blogs. So, I make sure that the whole staff reads the clips, and then my days start very early. Lately, they start with Congressional Women's Softball practice, which happens at from 7 to 8 a.m. It's a great bipartisan way to get to know women from both sides of the aisle. I've really enjoyed that. And then I focus on my committee hearings. I'm on the House Armed Services Committee and the Education and Workforce Committee. At the beginning of every week, I have a meeting with my legislative team to go over the week ahead, what legislation is pending, potential letters or legislation letters I want to sign or bills I want to co-sponsor, bills I'm going to introduce. And the days are very busy. I have a lot of constituents, as I'm sure most members do, that are a part of groups or associations or schools that are visiting Washington, and I always like to personally welcome them. Even if I have a committee hearing, I'll pop out of the committee hearing and make sure that they're able to see their representative and raise any issues that they have, but it's a very busy schedule.
It's not easy to run for Congress. It's also not cheap. How much did you raise in 2014, and have you started the process for 2016?
I raised $1.7 million, and this district it's a very large district. I had a very competitive primary and general election, and in both cases I was running against a self-funder. So I really prided our campaign on the number of low-dollar donors we had in the district, really building the fundraising structure at the grassroots level. And I'm off to a great start. I raised a great number in the first quarter, and I think it shows the support and the investment from people within the community. They believe in what you're doing, and they want to make sure that, this seat is protected. We've gotten a lot of support.
In her announcement, though, in New York City this year, Hillary Clinton said there's way too much money in politics. She needs to fix the system, pointed to Citizens United. What are your thoughts? Is there too much money in politics, and if so, how do you correct it?
I believe that making a donation is a constitutional right in terms of freedom of speech, and I believe that we need to have more transparency in our federal elections system today. For example, some states across the country have 100% transparency. You can donate $1 up to $1,000 or more than that, but it's disclosed to the voters. So I believe in transparency. I think that is an important step to take in the right direction. But in terms of Hillary Clinton, she's actively fundraising for her super PAC to support her campaign. So I think as a candidate, you ought to walk the walk and talk the talk, and she's just not doing that right now.
What's your relationship like with Speaker Boehner and the committee chairs and the leadership here in the House?
I have a lot of support from leadership, from the Speaker who came to the district to support me, has been very supportive of my committee assignments. I spoke to him very early about ensuring that I get appointments to the House Armed Services Committee and Education and Workforce. Particularly the House Armed Services is very competitive for freshmen, but I made the case very early why it was so important for me to have a seat at the table to protect and strengthen Fort Drum, which is home of the 10th Mountain Division, the most deployed unit in the U.S. Army. And in terms of the committee chairs, I also have a lot of support from Chairman Thornberry, who's head of Armed Services Committee. I'm the vice chair of the Readiness Subcommittee, which is a great position to have as a freshman. It's very rare for freshmen to be subcommittee chairs on the House Armed Services Committee. And I work very well with Chairman John Klein on the Ed and Workforce Committee. I think that the leadership is very supportive, and they understand that I'm not a typical member of Congress in the sense that the average age of a member of Congress is 58 and I'm 30, so I slice that in half pretty much. I'm younger than some of their kids, but they're very respectful. They treat me as a peer, and they understand that the district I represent is very independent. So I feel very comfortable voting on behalf of my district, which is why I was sent here.
But let me go back to being 30, almost 31 years old, and you sit in this office in the Cannon House office building, surrounded by pictures and memorabilia of your campaign and your service so far in Congress. Do you pinch yourself?
I pinch myself every day. I pinch myself. The first State of the Union is a historic event to be sitting on the House floor. When Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered the joint session, I looked around, and once again there was a moment, I can't believe I'm here. In February, I participated on a to a congressional delegation to Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, and for me, I was able to visit with 10th Mountain soldiers who were deployed to Afghanistan, but one of the visits we had was with President Ghani, the newly elected president of Afghanistan, and it was 4 members of Congress with the president. I pinched myself at that moment as well. So yes, it's a very awe-inspiring experience, and but you understand that the reason why you're put in office is to represent the people, your friends and neighbors from back at home. But when I stop pinching myself, I think it's time to go.
What advice did your mom and dad give you, or what's the best advice they've given you?
Both of my parents have given me great advice. My dad's advice, even since I was a kid, was don't tell me how smart you are, tell me how hard you work. And the real wisdom in that advice is, especially when I was school-aged, the harder you work, the smarter you become, just because you spend the time studying. So that was something he used to say to me, even in in elementary, middle, and high school, and I think that has served me well. And my mom's advice is always maintain a moral compass, and I think that's very good advice for anyone, but particularly when you're an elected official, it's very important, to live by the values you espouse. And I think that's, sometimes people are very disappointed in what they see in their elected officials, and particularly millennials don't have a very high approval rating of elected officials, people that get involved in politics, and I think that's part of the reason why they don't. So I think it's important to live by a moral compass.
And finally, you're here now, you're running for re-election, but have you given any thought to what's next and any other glass ceilings that you want to break?
I'm excited. I love representing this district. I'm working hard to make sure the promises I made on the campaign are kept, and I'm working on legislation. I think there's a lot that I can do in Congress on behalf of my district. So I'm not someone who plans 5-10 years in advance in terms of, if I do this, then this will open up. That's not who I am. If you had asked me 3 years ago that I'd be sitting in my office in Cannon on behalf of New York's 21's residents, I would have thought you were crazy. So I think it's really important to do as well as you can at the job that you have now, and that's what I'm focused on.
And when you're not here, what do you do to relax?
I like to cook. I love spending time outside. I grew up snow skiing, so at Whiteface and Gore Mountain, which are both in my district. I like doing that with my dad. I'm an avid reader. I love doing the C-SPAN book talk. That was a highlight for me. And I really enjoy theater, and actually when I was a kid I thought I was very involved in plays, and I loved going to Broadway shows every now and then when my mom would take me to New York City. So I really like the theater, I love the arts, and that's what I like to do outside of this job.
Elise Stefanik from New York's 21st Congressional District, Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.